The Pacific Ocean, autumn of 1944. The air above the Philippine Sea hung thick with salt and diesel smoke, the horizon broken only by the distant silhouette of American carrier groups moving in disciplined formation. From the cockpit of a Japanese Zero fighter, the world below appeared vast and indifferent, a gray expanse of water that stretched beyond reckoning, offering no shelter, no mercy, and no answer to the question that had begun to gnaw at the edges of Imperial Japan's most carefully constructed certainties. Something was wrong. Something had changed in the nature of the war itself. The bombs were following them, not in the loose, approximate way of conventional warfare, not in the pattern of guesswork and probability that both sides had learned to accept as the brutal arithmetic of aerial combat. These bombs were following the signals. They were following the invisible threads of radio frequency that Japanese officers had long considered the private language of military coordination, a language they believed the enemy could hear but never truly read, never truly answer. They were wrong, and the reckoning that followed would shake the ideological foundations of a military culture built upon the certainty of technological superiority, spiritual invincibility, and the conviction that the American industrial machine, for all its size, lacked the precision, the ingenuity, and the disciplined will to match the warriors of Yamato on terms that truly mattered. To understand what happened over the Pacific skies in those decisive months, one must first travel backward into the intellectual architecture of Imperial Japan's military establishment. The officers who commanded Japan's air and naval forces in the early 1940s were not foolish men. They were, by any honest measure, among the most rigorously trained military professionals on Earth. They had studied at institutions that demanded physical endurance, mathematical precision, and a philosophical framework that bound technological mastery to spiritual purpose. The Zero fighter, the Mitsubishi A6M, had entered the war as a genuine marvel, outperforming its contemporaries in range, maneuverability, and climb rate. In the opening campaigns of the Pacific War, Japanese aviators had dismantled Allied air forces with a combination of skill, aggression, and equipment that the enemy was simply not prepared to match. Pearl Harbor had been executed with a precision that stunned the world. The fall of the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, these were not accidents of fate. They were the products of meticulous planning, of a military culture that believed itself operating at the highest level of modern warfare. But within that confidence lay a structural vulnerability, one that the Japanese high command understood in theory but consistently underestimated in practice. Japan was a nation of limited industrial resources. Its oil came largely from territories it had seized by force. Its metals, its rubber, its capacity to absorb attrition. All of these existed on a narrower margin than its victories had suggested. American industry, by contrast, operated on a scale that defied the categories Japanese planners had constructed to manage their own strategic thinking. By 1943, American factories were producing aircraft at a rate that no other nation on Earth could approach. The Grumman Hellcat, introduced into combat in August of that year, had been designed with a specific purpose: to kill the Zero. It was faster, more heavily armed, more durable, and flown by pilots who had studied the Zero's strengths and built their tactics around defeating them. The margin that Japan had held in the early war years was narrowing with every month, every factory shift, every training class of American aviators who moved through the pipeline with a thoroughness that the Japanese system, stressed and depleted, could not replicate. Yet even as the balance shifted in the air, it was not only aircraft and pilots that would determine the outcome of the Pacific Air War. It was something far less visible, something that did not appear in the order of battle, something that existed in the electromagnetic spectrum itself, in the silent, invisible world of radio waves and frequency response. It was a technology so subtle in its operation, so counterintuitive in its implications, that it would take Japanese commanders months to understand what was happening to them, and longer still to accept that understanding as something other than rumor, exaggeration, or enemy propaganda. The technology was the proximity fuse, and it would change everything. The proximity fuse, the variable time fuse, classified by the Americans as the VT fuse to conceal its operating principle, was in the language of engineering an elegant solution to an ancient problem. Anti-aircraft gunnery had always been a discipline of probability, of calculating where an aircraft would be when a shell arrived at a given altitude, and trusting that the burst would occur close enough to do damage. Contact fuses required a direct hit, which was statistically improbable against a fast-moving target. Time fuses required precise range estimation, which introduced error at every step. What was needed was a fuse that would detonate not by contact, not by timer, but by proximity, by sensing the presence of the target itself and triggering at the moment of maximum effectiveness. The proximity fuse accomplished this by embedding a miniature radio transmitter and receiver inside the shell itself. As the shell flew through the air, it emitted a continuous radio signal. When that signal reflected off a solid object, an aircraft, a ship's superstructure, a dense formation of men, the returned frequency shifted according to the Doppler effect. When the shift reached a critical threshold, indicating that the target was within the lethal radius of the burst, the fuse detonated the shell. The bomb did not need to hit. It only needed to approach. The scientific foundations of this technology had been understood for decades. The Doppler effect, the change in frequency of a wave as its source or target moves relative to the observer, had been described by Christian Doppler in 1842 and had been applied to practical problems in physics and astronomy throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Radio wave reflection, the basis of radar, had been the subject of intensive research in Britain, the United States, Germany, and Japan through the 1930s. What made the VT fuse a genuine technological achievement was not any single scientific principle, but the extraordinary engineering challenge of miniaturizing a functional radio circuit small enough to fit inside an artillery shell, robust enough to survive the crushing acceleration of being fired from a gun, and reliable enough to function consistently under the brutal conditions of combat. The project had been assigned in 1940 to the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University, working under a contract with the National Defense Research Committee. It was one of the most tightly guarded secrets of the entire American war effort, ranked alongside the Manhattan Project in terms of the operational security measures taken to protect it. The British had conducted early research and shared their findings with American scientists under the terms of the Tizzer Mission of 1940, one of the most consequential scientific exchanges in the history of warfare. By the end of 1942, the fuse had been tested at sea and declared ready for operational deployment. The first combat use of the VT fuse came in January in 1943 aboard the cruiser USS Helena in the waters around Guadalcanal. A Japanese aircraft approached the ship in the darkness, and the Helena's gunners opened fire with the new fuses loaded. The aircraft was destroyed. The kill was noted, analyzed, and reported up the chain of command with the controlled excitement of men who understood that they had witnessed something significant. The fuse was, from that first deployment, extraordinarily effective. Where conventional anti-aircraft fire might require an average of several thousand rounds to destroy a single aircraft, the VT fuse dramatically reduced that expenditure. The numbers would be refined over subsequent engagements, but the pattern was consistent and unmistakable. Shells armed with the proximity fuse were killing at rates that conventional ammunition could not approach. American commanders who understood what they were observing were careful to keep their excitement disciplined. The technology was too valuable, too secret, and too fragile in its operational security to risk through any premature disclosure. The decision to restrict the fuse's initial deployment to naval operations was deliberate and carefully reasoned. The fear was not that the enemy would immediately understand the fuse's operating principle. That would take time and careful analysis of recovered fragments, but that shells which failed to detonate might land on land and be recovered intact. At sea, duds sank. They were recovered by no one. The ocean was the perfect security vault for a technology that had to be protected at almost any cost. It was not until late 1944, as the strategic situation in the Pacific reached a critical juncture, that the decision was made to expand the fuse's deployment more broadly and to accept the additional security risk that accompanied the wider use of a technology so valuable. By that point, the calculus had changed. The war was entering its final, most violent phase, and the need to protect American ships and aircraft from the intensifying Japanese air campaign, including soon the deliberate suicide attacks that would become known as kamikaze, outweighed the residual risk of enemy recovery and analysis. For Japanese naval aviators and the officers who directed them, the autumn of 1944 brought an accumulation of experiences that resisted easy explanation. Aircraft that had approached American ships and formations under conditions that should have given them the angles and altitudes necessary for effective attack were being destroyed at distances and in circumstances that did not conform to any established model of anti-aircraft effectiveness. Pilots who survived, and, as the months passed, there were fewer of these, brought back accounts of shells that seemed to track them, to anticipate their movements, to burst not when they struck anything, but at some precise and devastating moment of proximity that felt less like gunnery and more like something else, something for which the existing vocabulary of aerial combat had no adequate term. Officers reviewing combat reports found the pattern disturbing. It was not that American gunners had become more accurate. The trajectories, the angles, the geometry of the engagements did not support that interpretation. Something else was happening. Something in the shells themselves. The Japanese signals intelligence apparatus was, by 1944, a competent, if resource-constrained organization. It monitored American radio traffic, analyzed encrypted communications, tracked the electromagnetic signatures of American radar systems, and attempted to build from these fragments a coherent picture of enemy capabilities and intentions. What detected in the engagement records of the latter half of 1944 was anomalous. The explosions were occurring at ranges that contact fuses could not explain and at timings that time fuses, even precisely set, should not have produced. Some analysts, reviewing the fragmentary physical evidence recovered from duds and partial detonations, began to suspect that the shells were emitting their own radio signals, that the electromagnetic environment around American anti-aircraft guns had changed in some way that was related to the killing that was happening at those unprecedented ranges. The hypothesis was correct. The analytical path to its confirmation was slow, partially obstructed by the destruction of the very evidence that would have proved it, and complicated by a psychological resistance that is not difficult to understand. To accept that the Americans had miniaturized a functional radar set and placed it inside an artillery shell, to accept that they had solved an engineering problem of that complexity and deployed it at scale without any prior intelligence warning, required a revision of assumptions about American industrial and scientific capability that many in the Japanese establishment were not prepared to make. There is in the historical record a particular quality of silence that surrounds moments when a military institution confronts evidence that its foundational assumptions are wrong. It is not the silence of denial, though denial is part of it, but the silence of a system that has not yet developed the language to describe what it is experiencing. Japanese officers who understood, by late 1944, that something fundamental had changed in the technology of American anti-aircraft warfare were operating in exactly this kind of silence. They could describe the symptoms, the anomalous kill rates, the peculiar detonation patterns, the electromagnetic signatures their instruments were detecting, but the diagnosis required a leap of inference that the culture of the Imperial Japanese military made extraordinarily difficult. That culture valued certainty. It valued the authoritative pronouncement, the definitive assessment, the strategic judgment delivered from a position of established knowledge. To say, in that culture, that the enemy had developed a technology that you did not understand and could not counter was to make a statement whose implications extended far beyond the technical. It was to question the spiritual framework that held the entire war effort together. Because the ideology of Imperial Japan's military was not, at its core, a purely technological ideology. It was a synthesis of technological and spiritual claims, a framework in which Japanese martial virtue, the Bushido ethic, the concept of Yamato Damashii, the spirit of Japan, was understood to be a force multiplier that would, in a decisive moment, compensate for any material disadvantage. This belief was not merely rhetorical. It had been internalized by the officer corps, taught in the academies, embedded in the tactical doctrines, and expressed in the willingness of Japanese soldiers and pilots to accept casualties and undertake risks that Western military culture would have considered unsustainable. The kamikaze program itself was, in a sense, the ultimate expression of this ideology. The human body as the most precise guidance system available, the spiritual will of the individual as a weapon that technology alone could never fully counter. Against this framework, the proximity fuse was more than a technical problem. It was a philosophical challenge. It suggested that the material realm, the world of electromagnetic waves, miniaturized circuits, and industrial mass production, could defeat the spiritual realm in ways that the ideology of Yamato Damashii had not accounted for. The canned goods came later, carried ashore in the kits of American servicemen on islands and atolls across the Pacific, their labels bright and oddly cheerful against the grave violence of the war. Peaches, beans, corn, condensed milk. Japanese soldiers who encountered these supplies in captured positions or found them among the debris of battle were sometimes genuinely bewildered by them, not because the food itself was strange, but because of what its presence implied. These were not the emergency rations of a military stretched to its limits. These were the ordinary provisions of a nation that produced so abundantly that it could pack the luxuries of peacetime into the combat kits of soldiers fighting on the other side of the world. The tin can became, in the Pacific War, an unintentional symbol of the argument that American industrial civilization was making by its mere existence, that a democracy organized around the productive freedom of its citizens could generate a material surplus so vast that it overflowed even into the killing grounds of distant islands, even into the electromagnetic spectrum of the sky above a carrier task force, even into the interior of an artillery shell hurtling toward a Zero fighter at the edge of its operational range. The tin can did not argue. It did not speak. It simply was, and its being was sufficient. The full technical details of the proximity fuse were not confirmed by Japanese analysts until late in the war, when a combination of physical evidence, signals intelligence, and the testimony of captured technical documents allowed a clearer picture to be assembled. By that point, the operational damage had been done. The fuse had contributed to the destruction of hundreds of Japanese aircraft in the critical engagements of the Marianas Campaign, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and the prolonged agony of the kamikaze offensive. American ships that might have been sunk by conventional air attack survived because the aircraft approaching them were destroyed at ranges that the Japanese pilots had believed were safe, at altitudes they had believed were beyond effective anti-aircraft reach, using trajectories they had believed gave them angles of approach that conventional gunnery could not cover. The proximity fuse did not win the Pacific War, but it changed the mathematics of survival in ways that accumulated, engagement by engagement, into a strategic transformation. It was a technology that multiplied the effectiveness of every gun it was loaded into, every crew that fired it, every ship that carried it. It was the product of a scientific and industrial system that could take an abstract principle, the Doppler shift in a reflected radio wave, and translate it in 4 years, from laboratory experiment to mass-produced component fitted into tens of millions of shells and deployed across every theater of a global war. Japanese officers who survived the war and reflected on its course in later years returned repeatedly to the question of what had surprised them most about their enemy. The answers varied, but a consistent thread ran through them. It was not American courage, which they had expected. It was not American firepower, which they had anticipated, even if they had underestimated its scale. It was American ingenuity, the capacity to identify a problem, assemble the scientific and industrial resources to solve it, and then produce the solution in quantities that made it not an exceptional weapon, but a standard one, available to every ship, every battery, every crew that needed it. This was the thing that the ideology of Yamato Damashii had not prepared them to face, because it was not a spiritual quality or a martial virtue, but something more democratic and more diffuse. The organized intelligence of a society that had given its scientists the freedom to imagine, its engineers the resources to build, and its factories the incentive to produce. The proximity fuse was, in this sense, not merely a weapon. It was an argument about the relationship between freedom and capability, between the openness of a scientific culture and the depth of its strategic reserves. In the final months of the Pacific War, as American forces moved toward the Japanese home islands and the scale of the coming invasion began to be calculated in terms of casualties that staggered even those who had survived the previous 3 years, the proximity fuse continued its work in the electromagnetic silence of the anti-aircraft engagement. Unseen, unheard, leaving no trace except the sudden blossoming of fire where an aircraft had been. Kamikaze pilots who understood, in their final moments of approach, that something had changed, that the shells were finding them at distances that should have been safe, had no recourse within the framework they had been given. The ideology that had sent them to their deaths had not told them about the miniature radio transmitter inside the shell. It had not told them that the invisible world of electromagnetic waves had been weaponized with a precision that their spiritual preparation could not answer. The war ended in August 1945 in fire and silence, in the shadow of technologies that made the proximity fuse seem, by comparison, almost modest. But the fuse had done its work. It had protected American ships and the men aboard them. It had changed the calculus of the air war at its most critical juncture. And it had demonstrated, in a way that the subsequent history of science and warfare would continue to confirm, that the most decisive weapons are sometimes the ones that cannot be seen, that exist not in the visible world of ships and aircraft and men, but in the invisible world of wave and frequency and signal, in the silent conversation between a transmitter and its target. In the brief, lethal moment when the reflected wave returns and the circuit closes and the shell finds, without touching, the thing it was sent to destroy. There is a truth in that invisible arc that extends beyond the Pacific War, beyond the specific history of the VT fuse and the specific terror of Japanese officers who heard in their instruments the frequency of their own approaching deaths. It is the truth that freedom produces ingenuity in ways that command cannot manufacture, that a society which allows its scientists to question, its engineers to experiment, and its citizens to organize their productive energies according to their own judgment will, given time and necessity, find solutions that close systems.